This is the Consuming Watson Services in Python on Bluemix course. This is course 2. We've been looking at the Watson services, in particular the language services, and this is part 3 where we'll be looking at the natural language classification. So up to now, you've created an application which has been able to identify the language that your users are using and, if possible, translate that into a language that your application is expecting. And in this module, we're now going to extend that to actually understand the intention behind, or the intent behind, the question or the phrase that's been submitted by your end users. You can find the documentation for the natural language classifier off the Watson Developer Cloud homepage. It gives you a little bit of a background as to what the service provides. It is a service that you can train. The SDK examples show how to consume the API, and this code will be retrofitting into our application. Going back to the documentation, you see how to use the service. You do need to create a classifier for this. And if we have a look at the API reference, there is a Create Classifier API, which we won't be using directly, but we will be using indirectly to create our classifiers before we consume them. Let's go to our source code. This time around, we're going to be concentrating on the Flask application. The Django source code is there and looks very similar. It's just the framework is different. And likewise, you can fit this into any framework. So there are 3 key files. First, language translation has been taken out of our main file and been encapsulated into a class. This stops our main file from overgrowing. So we include the Watson Developer Cloud instance, and we've created a class language translation utils. This has a get translation service method, which is initialized in the constructor, in the init constructor, and that has the hard-coded credentials, still hard-coded at this stage. The identify language method has just been taken out of the main file back into this utility file. The same for the check for translation and the perform translation method. These methods are unchanged. They've just been added into our utility class to make the code tidier. We've created something similar for the natural language classifier. So again, we pull in the natural language classifier from the SDK. We have a natural language classifier utils class where we instantiate the natural language classifier with the credentials which we will obtain. We have a method to get hold of the service, and we have one method, classify the text. This is the only one we're going to be implementing. This method invokes the list function on the natural language classifier component, which fetches a list of all the classifiers that are available. We then loop through, picking out the first one. We pick the 0th element, so we're expecting at least 1, and we're only looking at the first one, and we're not doing anything intelligent in terms of picking a specific classification or classifier. We check its status, make sure that it's available, and then call the classify method on it, and then pull out the confidence and the class name. Just to iterate, we are only looking at the first classifier. If we want to make our application a bit more robust, there may be several classifiers, so we'll need to specify it in name or look for it by name. Come to the main module. We pull in, we import the 2 utilities that we just created. We have our single route into our application, WLLang. We instantiate each of those classes, and then if a translation is required, we perform a classification or classify the text after the translation, and if translation is not required, we classify the text. And add the classification to the output. And if we have a look at the classify method, this is a sample of how the response data is going to look. Let's switch over to Bluemix. We are in the UK region, and we're going to instantiate a new instance of the natural language classifier. So go into the catalog, filter by Watson, find the natural language classifier tile. We're going to leave it unbound, and we create the service. You can grab all of the service credentials, which we will do, and copy into our code. There is a toolkit available that will allow us to create our classifiers. We don't need to, we can use the REST APIs directly, but the toolkit makes it that much easier. Actually, that much easier to explain what's going on. So we have no classifiers so far. I'm going to create a new one. So we have to add in classes into this classifier. And these are intent. So I'm going to create a box office classifier whereby questions are going to be box office related. Class will be parking. I need to provide sample sentences, sample phrases that are parking related. We'll also create a payment class and create some sample text for it. A schedule class. A seatings class. And here we can see all the pieces of text that we've created. Now I've created text that have only a single class associated with them. You can have multiple classes associated with each sample text. I found one that hasn't been marked, so I can drag over a class and assign class to that piece of text. Before I create the classifier, I can save the file. Let's just have a look at what a sample comma-separated file input into the create classifier looks like. 2 columns. I see one that seems to have an error, which I'll correct. This is the one in error. I will delete that and recreate it. I need to assign a class to it. So these are my sample texts and my box office classes. I'm going to create a off domain class. Questions and phrases that are off domain, so they can be recognized. And they may still well be box office related. They're just not going to be recognized as seating, schedule, payment. File looks okay. I'm now going to create the classifier. Give it a name. This is all in English, but you have other language options available. And then we wait. But while we're waiting, we can try our application. So let's switch to the relevant source code directory. Now, the application should look for the classifier, find that it's unavailable, but still process the statement that we provided. So let's give it an English text, so that's not going to go through translation. Our application is working. If we have a look at our trace, our logs, we can see that there was an attempt to run the classification, just the classifier was not available, so it wasn't used. And we can see in the source code where that's happening. So if a classification has not been found, it won't be added to the output text. Continue to wait. Now the classifier is ready. We can use the toolkit to test it out. We haven't actually created any test data, but we can try it out with sample phrases, and these should be phrases that are not part of the training data. So the can I bring food has been classified correctly as off domain, but what time is the box office open has been classified incorrectly. We're going to mark that as such, and we're going to add both of these to the training data. Box office questions are payment related. We'll take out the parking classification. You can create a new classifier. So the important lesson here is that you can't update classifiers. You can only create or remove them. So we give this one a new name, and our application won't be able to cope because it's only looking for the first classifier it finds, and it might be either one of these. So we're going to need to delete this old classifier. We could have made our application a bit more robust and that it was actually looking for a specific name or looking for both. And now if we try the application, we see that it's coming back with a classification. That's giving us 100% confident because the sentence matched one of its training phrases. Where can I buy shoes is off domain, which is good, but only 33% confidence. My shoes don't fit is translated correctly, but it's seeing it as a schedule classification, so that would need to go back into the training data. But for our purposes, we're ready to push the application, so let's make some final changes. For Bluemix, we'll change the runtime, make sure it's 351, and we'll modify the manifest file to a unique name and host. We're now ready to push our application. Make sure that we're in the same directory as the manifest file, so we don't actually have to specify the file. Our application is now running. So let's go to the Bluemix dashboard. Find our newly created application. It's showing a staging, but it is running for some reason. Let's go into our application. We know there's no root level route, and try some sample sentences. First in English. The response a little bit slower than before, but it's coming back with a confidence level for the language and for the classification. Try a different language. It's been detected correctly. It's been translated, and we now have a classification for it. So at this stage, your users can submit text in any language. Your application will identify the language, perform a translation, and also determine the intent.